All right, my geeslings, take two of this introduction because the last time I forgot to turn on my mic, so I'm just going to pretend that I haven't already said this and gone through all of it. But this episode is with Professor Richard Kimberly Heck of Brown University. We have already had one conversation. It was episode 5, in which we talked broadly about the philosophy of pornography. Talking to Riki is great because their command of the literature is just amazing. And what makes it all the more amazing is that their primary focus of interest historically has been logic and the history of logic. So I can only imagine that talking to them about logic would be downright scary. But in this episode, episode 17, we go deeper into the philosophy of pornography because our first episode was much more of an introduction to the topic, what it is that a philosopher of pornography might do, the aesthetics of pornography, some concerns about dealing with it just as an academic, since it's clearly can be a controversial topic. In this episode, however, we go over much more of the nitty gritty, and by that I mean porn villains, monstrous female sexuality, anal sex, the ethics of sexual fantasies and kinks, and the transformative power of queer pornography, among other things like consent or the problem of authenticity in porn. And while I obviously knew that anal sex and consent were things, I had never ever considered them from a serious philosophical point of view. Anyway, so I find this episode much more engaging than the first one, even though, again, I think the first one, episode 5, is probably my best show to date. So I guess I think 17 is the best show to date. By way of apology, however, I mentioned for the second time in 17 episodes, the first one being with my dad, Ernst Becker's The Denial of Death. And it's not a book that I particularly like or anything. I read it once, maybe 10 years ago. But what I reference, and it was topical, I guess, is that the author hypothesizes that man fantasizes about sucking his own penis as a way or as an expression of his desire to sort of repeat himself over and over again. He wants to reproduce himself and live forever. And by repeating this for the second time, I'm clearly destined to repeat myself like the man sucking his penis or the snake eating its tail over and over again for however long I continue doing this podcast. Mm-hmm. Without further ado, I hope you really enjoy this episode because I did. I really enjoyed our last conversation, like I said before, and I think I ended it saying, wow, we really only got through about a quarter of what I had written down, but by the end of our conversation, I saw that, or I figured we'd gotten to about a tenth of what we could have talked about. And then you just sent me the syllabi to two of your classes, philosophy of pornography and philosophy of sex. And now I realized that we have scratched far less of the surface than I'd even realized, because there's really an extensive literature around all sorts of topics that I hadn't even known were topics in academia. But one of the things I did do in the past few days is I watched The Mirror Game, which is one of the pornographic films you suggested. And so I immediately grasped the feminist element of it, in that, one, it depicted a healthy relationship between the protagonist and her husband. It was also supposed to be a film. There were themes with mirrors, and there was attention paid to filmography. But I'm wondering if there's anything you think I might have missed that really makes it at least for the topics of our conversation, an exemplar of feminist pornography?
I think it's that film is I mean it's quite a strange story, right? I mean it's
Yeah, do you
the
want to
relationship is
recapitulate it?
healthy until I mean so the I mean there is this married couple and they the relationship is portrayed as thriving and so forth, and but then she goes into this occult bookstore and comes across this book which she ends up buying and casting a spell on herself and turning herself into some kind of, I don't know what she turns into, but her eyes shine and
A sex
she
fiend
she
demoness or
turns into
something.
like so after that the relationship isn't so healthy. But I think in many ways I think what Angie's trying to do in these films is to, I mean, that one's a bit different from some of the others because it's so fantastical. But I think she's trying very much in that one to kind of play with the sort of femme fatale trope that you see in a lot of, even Hollywood films. So I think that film could be compared to a lot of uh, Hollywood movies in which women become these sort of monstrous kind of figures. I actually had a student for the class this semester write her final paper on the sort of monstrous theme of female sexuality that you see in lots of excuse me, lots of places. I mean, not pornography being in a way the last of them. So I think that sort of theme is pretty common in Western literature about women's sexuality. So I think Angie was trying to, in a way, kind of tell that story from the point of view of the woman character, rather
When
than
you say, oh, sorry, I
go no
thought
go
you were
ahead, that's fine.
finished. When you say monstrous feminine or female sexuality, the first thing that comes to my mind is dentata. I think that there's a movie by that name, but I also think it's some old urban legend
Mm-hmm.
or myth where the vagina has teeth in it that will
Yeah,
bite off the
yeah,
male penis.
yeah.
But is there anything in particular you're referring to? Because I haven't really thought of feminine sexuality as
I'm
monstrous.
trying to remember. So I think there is this sort. I mean, so that's one kind of classic version of this. But I think there's the monstrous element. I think is a kind of outgrowth of the sort of woman as temptress kind of model that, of course, goes back to
Right.
the very earliest Judeo-Christian uh, thought about sexuality. So I think in many ways, I think you see sort of sexually, um, what's the word I want? Kind of women who are very sexual and kind of want sex and enjoy sex are often portrayed as kind of dangerous in various ways, and the monstrous element is just sort of a the end point of that in some sense. I'm trying to remember what this. I can't even remember which student it was. Although you get 35 papers and they all sort of blur together in your head. I'm trying to remember kind of the themes that she picked out, but at the moment it's slipping my mind. Um, but she talked about vampire stories and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
with women characters in them. That's another version of this.
Yeah, I can see though, thinking about it now, how in the mirror game that is kind of turned on its head because when she casts this spell, one, it's sort of a female emancipation tale in a sense
Mm-hmm.
because she's losing her inhibitions that have been placed on her elsewhere. And then the sex scene, I think there are three maybe sex scenes in the
Mm-hmm.
movie. That was one of the very jarring things for me. So
Mm-hmm.
sat down to watch this with a quart of ice cream. I was going to pay attention to it, and I'm enjoying the plot. And then 20 minutes in, the sex comes, and there's like a 10-minute sex scene,
Mm-hmm.
and I was getting into the plot, and it really
Uh-huh.
threw me off. And
Yeah.
so, just as an aside, I was wondering if that's kind of one of the reasons that the porn film isn't around as much anymore,
Mm-hmm.
is that it's kind of a jarring viewing experience.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so in the sex scene, the first sex scene, she casts the spell, and then she comes up the stairs while her husband's asleep, and
Mm-hmm.
he gets up and sees her walk into the room, and she walks to him and then just sort of knocks him back onto the bed,
Yeah.
and then they have sex. And she doesn't seem like the villain. It seems more like she is coming to terms with her own power on some level.
Yeah.
And then there's
Yeah.
an extensive masturbation scene when she's alone,
Mm-hmm.
and I can see how that ties into this same idea of her empowerment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a sort of she both becomes kind of sexually empowered, but she sort of pays for it with her soul in a way.
Yeah.
I think the um, in that film, I do think the sex. So actually, when Angie came to talk to the class, she mentioned that she herself, in some ways, enjoys. Well, I think in many ways, enjoys the plot-oriented parts of filmmaking more than she enjoys shooting sex. That she has, I think, over time become much more of a storyteller than just shooting sex scenes for the sake of shooting sex. I think in that film, a little less so than some of her other films, the sex scenes, while they are an integral part of the story, they don't develop the story kind of as much as in, say, Gone, which is a very different film of hers, where the story is in a way told through the sex scenes. Those,
Hmm.
and I think in Mirror Game, the sex scenes could be a lot shorter and it wouldn't really affect the storytelling that much. Whereas I think in Gone, it's, you really would lose a lot if you were to take them out.
So one of the topics in your philosophy of pornography class that this links to, interestingly to me, is the porn villain. So
Mm-hmm.
in you mentioned earlier monstrous female sexuality, and in this case the protagonist is monstrous in some way, but
Mm-hmm.
it's more has more of a positive valence to it. But the porn villain in most pornography it's usually a man. Well, that's not always true, because I mean stepsister pornography I know is very
Mm-hmm.
big right now,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a whole other can of worms,
Yeah.
but it involves the stepsister to seductress. But it's typically the porn villain is the man who's, I don't know, uh, running the casting couch or
Mm-hmm.
extorting
Yeah.
women for sex.
Yeah.
But I thought some of the titles were interesting. So one of the paper was called "Choke on It, Bitch: Porn
Yeah.
Studies Extreme Gonzo and the Mainstreaming of Hardcore," and then "What This Professional Porn Villain Can Teach Us About Sex and Consent."
Mm-hmm.
So, what does the porn villain have to teach us?
So, I think so. Those papers are. I won't talk specifically about those papers though. The first one you mentioned, "Choke on It, Bitch," is by a guy named Stephen Madison, who has written a lot about. So the kind of porn studies movement has often, in a way, because of the politics of the thing, found it very difficult to criticize pornography, because you're trying to on one hand, you have to kind of fight this battle to just defend the legitimacy of studying pornography as an academic enterprise. And so to kind of criticize it can feel uncomfortable for people sometimes. And so Madison has really taken that on himself to try to use some of the resources that have been developed in porn studies to give an articulate criticism of what he calls extreme gonzo. The porn villain one is interesting, I think, because it actually has to do with this very specific website and pornography creator. I can't remember the name he goes by. It's been a while since I read that paper. But he produces content involving things like a man breaking into a woman's house and raping her, and sometimes like killing her even.
Hmm.
So quite violent fantasies. And what I think a lot of times it can be difficult for people to. Well, I'll make a kind of broad claim and then maybe try to defend it a little bit. So many people have really out there sexual fantasies. It's not at all unusual. I mean, the kind of typical one that everyone kind of knows about is women having fantasies about being raped, but lots of people have really out there sexual fantasies involving things that they would never themselves want to experience, not really interested in doing, but for whatever reason the fantasy kind of does it for them, and so they use it for the usual sorts of for purposes that one would use sexual fantasy for. And so there's a whole like other literature that we actually do talk about in the philosophy of sex course quite a bit about the kind of ethics of sexual fantasy. Some people,
Hmm.
so I mean, in a way, the kind of woman who fantasizes about being raped, a lot of people have kind of concerns, various kinds of ethical concerns about that, but they kind of can excuse it because they think well, women are oppressed anyway, and so they tell some story that begins with that. But if you kind of look at the flip side and look at a kind of man who has fantasies about raping a woman, women sometimes have fantasies like this too. There's actually not a huge gender difference on this. People become very, very uncomfortable because they think, the first thing people often think is, well, this person really does want to go kind of rape people, or they think that, something else is wrong, that someone would have fantasies like that. And, I certainly think that it's possible, I mean, for fantasizing about such things to be problematic. But for most people, at least the empirical literature that I know on this, you can't predict very much about someone by knowing whether they have fantasies like that or not. It's there are extremely weak correlations that people have found, but they're very, very weak. And so my own attitude about this tends to be that there need not be anything morally problematic about fantasies like that, as long as they stay in the realm of fantasy and people distinguish fantasy from reality. And so there's that whole issue. And then you kind of overlay that onto the pornography question. So the kind of pornography that this porn villain makes is basically kind of dramatic tellings of these kinds of very out there sexual fantasies. And I think part of what Chantal Tibbles is the person who wrote that. She's a sociologist. Um, she's interested in the question of sort of what we make of fantasies like this, and how I think how the discomfort we feel with fantasies like that can affect our viewing of pornography, our reaction to certain kinds of pornography. In fact, I think a lot of the time it seems to me that a lot of the debate over so-called violent pornography is really a debate about certain kinds of sexual fantasies, and people kind of aren't realizing that that's what they're actually what's actually disturbing them is the fantasy that's being portrayed, and not really got very much to do with the pornography itself. It's the underlying fantasy that's bothering people.
Yeah, I'm particularly curious about now the ethics of fantasies, because that's something that I haven't ever considered. I would have just imagined that so long as one kept something to oneself and didn't act on it, there was no real ethical component to it at all. In particular, I'm struggling to see what the ethical concern of fantasizing about being raped would be. I
Mhm.
can see that the other way around of the fantasy of raping, it might be easier to argue that that's immoral because it's in some way, I don't know. Well, I guess it doesn't have to be misogynistic. It can be
Mhm.
uh, what is the opposite? Misandrogyny,
Yeah, misandrist,
misandry,
I think. Yeah.
yeah, misandrist. Uh, but anyway, what is the ethical
So,
debacle
I
there?
mean, I should say I kind of struggle to make sense of this myself in some ways. My own, my own sex education was largely provided through two books that I discovered while babysitting as a teenager. One was the Height Report on Female Sexuality, which was done by this woman named Sherry Height. Was a very early study of thousands of women who answered these surveys. And but the other one was a book called My Secret Garden by Nancy Frege, which was, I think, published in 1972, so 50 years ago, um, which was the first really serious study of women's sexual fantasies. And Friday makes kind of the theme of the book in many ways is that um, the relationship between sexual fantasies and kind of one's ordinary life is extremely complicated, and you can't read very much off what someone fantasizes about. At the time, it was a pretty common view that women secretly wanted to be raped. This was a kind of broadly kind of Freudian sort of psychoanalytic idea, though I think its roots were deeper, and so Friday was kind of fighting that to some extent. But part of what drives that discussion is that various people, but I think kind of most famously Catherine McKinnon, have argued that part of what maintains the system of gender inequality is the fact that um, dominance in men is eroticized, whereas submission in women is eroticized. So I think if you think about this for a minute, you can see that this is true, right? That the kind of demure, kind of retiring, shy woman is seen as very erotic, whereas forceful, assertive kind of women are seen as bitchy and masculine, and conversely for men. So one might worry that fantasizing about rape is the sort of extreme end of this, because that's the kind of you know maximally what word do I want? Situation where men are at their kind of most sexually dominant and women are at their most sexually submissive is in raping and being a victim of rape. So I think in part of what drives concern about this, I think, is that by engaging in such fantasizing, one is kind of reinforcing the erotic structure of gender dominance. And now, I think it's far from clear to me that that's true. I think it's certainly possible that um, people's having these kinds of fantasies is a reflection of these kind of social arrangements. Uh, but whether individual people fantasizing about this thing sustains those kinds of social structures, I think is far from clear to me. Um, and so most of the people, at least the most interesting person I think I've read recently on this, actually happens to be an old friend of mine from graduate school, Susan Dwyer, um, who goes at it from a more kind of Aristotelian virtue ethics sort of angle. So she tries to disown any interest in a kind of consequentialist way of thinking about this, so that fantasizing about these things would have bad consequences. She thinks that fantasizing about things like this is a, how does she put it? In one of her papers, she says it sort of endangers your character in a way. So Aristotelian virtue ethics people are big on the idea that moral evaluation has to do oftentimes with the character of the person who's involved, and less with consequences and things like that. So she thinks it's kind of makes you a worse person in a way, that you would have fantasies like this, so that you shouldn't cultivate them. She's aware, as anyone else is, that we're rarely in control. It's kind of a famous thing that sex therapists will say, that we're not responsible for what turns us on. That's just, nobody, you're just not. But I think Sue's attitude is, but you can decide whether to cultivate that in a way or not. You could, to some extent, you can pick and choose what you choose to be. You can't change how you react to it, but you can decide whether you seek it out or kind of actively pursue it or not. So that's the kind of that's the sorts of reasons that people will give to have concerns about these kinds of fantasies.
So this discussion of Aristotelian ethics raises a kind of a meta question about this whole endeavor for me. So when I arrived at Columbia, I was under the impression that philosophy was in the business of answering questions. So it was in the business of telling us what mathematical objects are, for
Mm-hmm.
instance. But something that Chaim Gafman really instilled in me and eventually convinced me of is that philosophy is not so much about answering questions, because all philosophical programs eventually fail, but it's about providing insight
Mm-hmm.
into these questions that we're asking. So I don't think that when people think pornography, they think philosophy. When they think philosophy, they don't think pornography. The two
Mm-hmm.
don't appear to be related at all. So I'm wondering what philosophy provides to this discussion. I understand
Mm-hmm.
why a sociologist might be writing about what the professional porn villain can teach us about sex and consent. And I'm wondering if I'm on the right track, that
Yeah.
it is kind of just giving us insight into maybe how the sociologist is evaluating the problem.
So I tend to share this kind of attitude. I mean, I do think I do think there's such a thing as philosophical progress, and that sometimes questions get
Maybe that was a bit bleak.
resolved. But generally, I mean, of course, that's right. I mean, the kinds of questions that philosophers talk about don't tend to have easy answers. I remember when I was a TA as a graduate student myself, Judy Thompson was teaching a kind of introductory philosophy course at MIT, and the last day of class, a student raised their hand and said, "Professor Thompson, all these questions we've been discussing are very interesting, but when are you going to tell us what the answers are?" And, half the class laughed, right? And I thought it was striking that it was only half the class, right, who
Mm-hmm.
laughed. The other half was waiting, just as this person was, to be told what the answers were. And I wish I could remember what Judy said, because it was, at the time, I think I was laughing too much to pay attention. But so what does philosophy have to add here? And I think, I think in many cases, I'm not a person who sort of thinks as philosophy in the business, as being in the business of conceptual analysis or anything like that. But I do think in many cases, there really is just a kind of tremendous lack of clarity about the terms in which the debate is being conducted. This is all the more, I mean, my favorite version of this nowadays is in this ballpark, is kind of talk about consent and the place of
Yeah,
consent in
that's where I
sexual
was going to go
ethics.
next.
And, it's, I think one of the things that we've seen in that is that, so I mean, again, this is just sort of my view about this, but one shouldn't underestimate the progress that the notion of consent kind of, in putting the notion of consent in the center of sexual ethics, that was a tremendously important thing to happen, 50 years ago or so. I mean, before that, rape was largely seen as a property crime. So it was a crime either
Wow.
against the woman's father, because she would be less marriageable if she was raped, or it was a crime against her husband, who's, has the exclusive right to this woman's sort of sexuality. The idea that sort of women might be in charge of their own sexuality was actually a hard one. Sorry, let me just. Um, I mean, that took doing to even think that the consent would be a factor here. But it's become so dominant that it's kind of the only thing, it's the only word that people have. So consent has become an almost programmatic notion where people, consent is kind of whatever has to be in place for sex to be morally permissible. And so the notion of consent has been stretched kind of enormously far from its origins. And I think many, in ways that kind of can make it hard to sort of see what might be wrong with consensual sex in some cases. And I think that's become more and more clear over the last, I don't know, say 10 years or so, that sex can be consensual and still be profoundly harmful and even traumatic for one of the parties who are involved. And I think in some ways that has taken a lot of doing to try to get people to see that, because people are kind of so tied to the idea that consent is not only a necessary condition for morally permissible sex, but that it has to be a necessary condition as well. And so, you get people talking about things like affirmative consent and enthusiastic consent and ongoing consent. And I don't have a problem with the kind of underlying idea, but framing it in terms of consent, I think, ends up being really unhelpful, because, if you go in to have surgery, say, and you sign a consent form, you don't have to be enthusiastic about having the surgery. I mean, either you consent to the surgery or you don't. Same for getting, think about the kind of ordinary places that we talk about consent: sharing of medical information, having your car searched by the police, surgery, all kinds of things like that. And that's kind of where the notion of consent kind of has its natural home. And if you think, if you the more you kind of try to pack into the notion of consent, I think, and the farther you take it away from this, pre-existing notion, it starts to become, I think, just very hard to kind of keep track of the ethics of the situation. And so my own view, as I think many people nowadays think, is that we really should go back to thinking of consent as a kind of very minimal condition on morally acceptable sex, and try to articulate something else that's different from consent, that's actually necessary as well if sex is to be okay. So I think philosophy is one of the, it's not that only philosophers can do this kind of work, but I think philosophers are particularly well trained to do that kind of work, to try to look at, I mean, sometimes people nowadays talk about conceptual engineering. I don't personally like to talk that way. But in here, I think it's really a matter of kind of thinking deeply about the moral structure of these kinds of situations and trying to identify, features of different kinds of situations that are ethically concerning or ethically relevant. And as I say, I think philosophers are just quite, we're well trained to do that kind of thing, to kind of think through conceptually fraught sorts of areas and make some kind of contribution.
So beyond the minimal condition of consent for morally permissible sex that you just mentioned, what sort of thing do you have in mind for this stronger necessary condition?
So
Probably not like a contract
Yeah,
signed by
so
six witnesses.
I think there one. Oh, I'm having trouble here. Coffee keeps dripping down my face. So one thing that people have articulated, which I think is definitely a step in the right direction, is to distinguish consenting to sex from wanting sex. So if you think this is a distinction that it turns up in some of the sociological literature, but it also has kind of surfaced in philosophical literature, especially this woman named Anne Cahill. Um, but consenting to sex is very different from wanting to have sex. So you can consent to sex that you don't want to have. Um, you can, and there can be good reasons to do this, and there can be bad reasons to do this. So a kind of good side version of this would be a case where you're acting out of generosity. So imagine that your partner has had a really bad day at work, and that certain, say if they had a blowjob or you went down on them, then that would make them feel better. It's not kind of what you really would want to do, but you sort of think, it's going to make them feel better, so I will do this for them. It's a kind of giving act, to do this. Other kind of versions might be, if they're going on vacation and you haven't had sex for a while, and they'd really like to have sex before they go, and you could kind of take it or leave it, but you agree to do it, right? So those kinds of cases seem kind of morally okay, but and I think in a way where a lot of this literature starts. I mean, it turns out that it's extremely common in women's experience to have sex, to consent to sex they don't want to have, and there are lots of reasons that women will do this. Usually, I mean, oftentimes it's kind of social pressures that they sort of feel that they've led the guy on, or they've let him take them out to dinner, or they've done this or that or the other thing, and they kind of feel like they owe it to the guy. There are other cases, the really tragic ones are cases where women, I mean, and women will say exactly what I'm about to say, which is they consented to sex so that they wouldn't be raped. I mean, in effect, they realized they were going to have sex one way or the other. They could either consent to it or not. It was going to happen. So they decide to consent to it. And they, so they definitely do not want to be having sex with this person, but they have consented to do it. So one thing you might think, though I think some of these cases suggest, I mean, the kind of generosity cases suggest this isn't enough, is that we should look not just at kind of consent as a matter of permission or agreement, but at something like desire. That in order for sex to be ethical, so this is Anne Cahill's view, for example, that in order for sex to be ethical, it should be driven not just by this kind of agreement, but it should be shaped by the desires of the people who are involved in the right way. And I think that is I think that gets you a kind of slight feeling of what it might look like to have a more articulate, a more demanding view of what's required. That And so in Cahill's, she's very careful to say, look, it's not just a matter of whether you desire sex or whether you don't desire sex, but a question of what role your desire is playing in shaping the interaction. The
Right, and
second
there are
thing, go
obviously
ahead.
way more factors like intoxication impairs your ability to distinguish between consent and desire.
Yeah. And I think there's actually a guy at Brown named Sam Director who's written some interesting papers on consent and intoxication. Um, um, that's been a theme. I mean, for most, um, most at least people will tell you, right, that it's impossible to consent to sex if you're intoxicated. But I think Sam and many other people, I mean, who've written about this have raised questions about why that should be true. I mean, if you go
Right.
get a tattoo, for example, when you're drunk, we don't think that the tattoo artist should be prosecuted for tattooing you because you signed a consent form when you were inebriated. At least I
And it
don't
might
know of
lead
any person like
might
that.
lead to contradictions or nonsense if you have two intoxicated people and then you lead to the conclusion that they have raped one another, which just
Yeah.
doesn't seem. It seems like a twisting of the language.
Yeah, I mean, this is the deepest problem with consent, I think, and this has been pointed out again by many people. There's a really nice paper on this, which I don't think he ends up in quite the right place, by Jonathan Jenkins Ishikawa, that consent is an inherently asymmetrical thing, right? When there's consent, there is someone who's
Yeah.
asking for consent and there's someone who's giving consent. And while lip service is paid to the idea that both sides should consent and so forth, in fact, we all know who's doing the asking and who's doing the consenting in most cases. And that asymmetry is, I think, itself ethically concerning. Um, and so I think we would like to try to find a kind of ethical structure that wasn't inherently asymmetric in this way. And I think that's one plus for Cahill's view, that if her view is that both in fact both parties, or all parties if we're talking about more than two people, should want what's happening and their desires should be relevant in the right way to what happens. I think that's certainly trying to, as my student Rachel Ledden in her dissertation points out, I mean, it's there's something kind of heteronormative about consent talk too, because of um, the asymmetry that I mentioned, and the fact that that asymmetry is highly gendered, in fact. Though again,
Mhm.
sort of lip service is paid to the idea that it's not, but in fact it is.
So consent is a very hot and important topic around college campuses in particular, and Columbia University with the mattress
Mm-hmm.
incident a few years ago. It's been sort of at the center of that discussion. But it looks like from your syllabus, there's an extensive literature around consent, particularly on college campuses. And
Mm-hmm.
one thing in particular, you made a note that there were some, and I guess I'm quoting your note, there are some extremely disturbing remarks made by some of the male subjects in the Oskowski and Peterson paper. And
Yeah.
what this leads me to wonder is, I mean, you said rape was considered a property crime, which would have been considered uh, not backwards 50 years ago or
Mm-hmm.
before, but it suggests that there are still a lot of backwards views, even on college campuses, about
Mm-hmm.
uh, consent. So I'm curious about what those comments were, or what they might have been
Yeah.
like.
So that paper, that's a very disturbing paper by Jaskowski and Peterson, and they so basically you find a lot of men in these studies. I mean, it's not, we're not talking about half of men, we're talking about a significant percentage of men who make it clear that they see consent as a kind of box to be checked, and if it can't get checked, then they have strategies for avoiding it. So it's not in that paper, but it's in a different. Actually, I think it is in that paper. Actually, I can't remember. Anyway, but this will give you the kind of flavor of it. So I can't remember if it's in that paper or not, but they were talking about anal sex, which is its own sort of interesting topic with pornography and its influence on sexuality. But men, so one guy says, women really hate anal sex, so you just got to stick it in there before, and don't ask, right? Don't ask them whether they'll let you do this. You just got to do it, and and that's that. And that's like you stick it in there because they hate it. I mean, that's what kind of warped perspective on sex is this person operating with? And you get sort of comments like that from a lot of the men in these studies. I think Jaskowski and Peterson, when you kind of get, they're trying to maintain a sort of um, academic kind of neutrality and objectivity, but you can tell that they're kind of really deeply disturbed by some of the things that they were hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Ways in which men will, just even, not with anal intercourse, but with vaginal intercourse, just kind of, oh, accidentally, sorry, I guess it's in now, so we might as well go ahead, who sort of manipulate situations in those sorts of ways. And, um, so I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that everybody's on board with consent, so we don't even have to worry about that anymore. I mean, we do still have to sadly worry about that. Um, but I think it's clear at the same time that, as I said, you get this kind of box checking attitude, a sort of once she's consented, you kind of do what you damn well please, and kind of she's out of the equation. Her body's there, but she's just sort of out of the equation now. So once she's consented, you can do whatever you want with her body, and that's kind of the end of it. And that's what leads, I think, to a lot of these situations of women feeling deeply traumatized by sex, that that even they may want to have very much wanted to have sex with this person, but the way the sex itself plays out leaves them feeling like they might as well have been a doll or something. That there's a really wonderful piece by a woman named Reina Gattuso about an experience that she had like this, that I have my students read, where she just says, I've never been with somebody where I just felt like I might as well not be there as a human being. And that's that I fear that sort of the way we talk about consent gives the impression that that's all it is. I mean, sort of, you just have to check that box, and then you kind of go on and do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm. I think anal sex is very charged in our culture in a way. I don't know if that's because of historical uh, concerns or people hating on Sodom and Gomorrah, uh, or if it's just a cultural fixation with poop and butts being bad. But I think there was an anal sex dimension to the mattress incident at
Mm-hmm.
Columbia, which is what added to the fervor.
Mm-hmm.
But I do find myself curious about the anal sex literature, particularly because of all of the papers you cited. This one had the best title, which was it was by Brianne Foz and Jax
Yeah.
Gonzalez, and it was called "The Front Lines of the Back Door:
Yeah.
Navigating Disengagement, Coercion, and Pleasure in Women's Anal Sex Experiences." And I think we already probably touched on the coercion
Mm-hmm.
when you mentioned sort of like the oops
Yeah.
or just stick it in there strategy.
Mm-hmm.
But what else is going on in this literature?
So I think so. Actually, the one paper, well, actually, I published two papers, but one of the papers that I published in this area now has a short section that was largely inspired by that paper.
Okay.
That goes back to some of the things we were talking about last time, the ways that pornography kind of shapes real world sexuality. And one of the things
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of clear, there's a kind of huge study of American sexual behavior that's done about every decade out of the Kinsey Institute, which I think is at the University of Indiana. I can't remember. Um, but one of the things they've noticed is that the number of people who either have at least tried anal sex or who regularly have anal sex has just shot way up over the last like 20 years. I mean, just huge
Yeah, it
increase.
surprises me from
Yeah.
talking to just my friends and peers how common it is.
Yeah, it's it's hard to imagine that pornography doesn't have a place in this.
Yeah.
It's because it's just so common in mainstream pornography, and um, and so one kind of small thing about the role pornography has here is that you rarely in pornography do you see the kind of preparation that's needed for anal intercourse. Lube for one thing. And so a lot of women have report like real pain with anal intercourse. And often the reasons are lack of lubrication, lack of time that's given. I mean, especially if you're not experienced with this, you have to be very slow and, let somebody adjust and so forth. And so people don't do this because they see, they see pornography and it looks like it's sort of, all just as easy for women to have anal intercourse, receptive anal intercourse, it is for them to have vaginal intercourse. And, that's just not, I mean, if you're a professional, that's one thing, but, if you're not, then that's just not true. And so I think that makes it a kind of interesting case study of the way that pornography affects real world sexuality. But the most interesting thing in the Foss and Gonzalez paper is that they report that lots of women in their study report what I these are my words, not theirs, a kind of cultural pressure to have anal sex, that they kind of think that this is something that women are expected to do or should do, or at least if your relationship is really serious, it's something that you will do. And so it's not just that, I mean, so it looks as if kind of, and again, I mean, it's hard to know what would be causing this kind of cultural shift if it wasn't really rooted in pornography. So it looks like pornography has kind of, to some extent, shifted cultural norms around anal sex, not just to destigmatize it, which is a good thing, but to actually make it so that it's kind of considered part of what one does sexually, just kind of part of ordinary sex. Whereas, when I was in college, at least, 30 years ago, that's just not at all the way things were seen. I mean, it wasn't that it was this, I mean, that it was like nothing that anybody ever talked about, but it was certainly not seen as just kind of an ordinary part of everyday sexuality. And I don't think it's quite to that stage yet, but it's moved a lot in that direction. And it's so again, it makes for I think a kind of really interesting example of ways in which pornography has shaped sexuality, and I think not necessarily to women's benefit. I mean, I think that there are enough kind of cultural demands on women to act sexually in certain kinds of ways, and to sort of throw in another one like this, just I think the way I put it in the paper is that this is a shift that's happened without much input from women and without much attention really to what women's sexual needs and desires are. It's not bad in itself that there's been a change in sort of sexual norms. What's bad is that it's happened in a kind of very one-sided way.
Yeah, it's fascinating how it anal sex was. I don't know if I'm sure it's not one of the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt not have anal sex," but it was once, uh, at least as far as I picture history, a serious sin, and then it
It was
probably became
criminal
like
until the Bowers decision. It was criminalized in many
okay,
states.
and then it became a fetish or a kink or something like that. But now, as you mentioned, it's very mainstream. And I was recently watching, I mentioned last week, that show Euphoria,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the characters begins sort of like a webcam sort of business, and she attracts clients who she calls her pay pigs, who she belittles while they
Mm-hmm.
masturbate, and then also make she also makes them pay her. And I also know
Uh,
from talking to people that this actually happens
yeah.
in real
Yep.
life. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something so far from my experience that, I mean, that's the last thing that I would want
Yeah.
to be, is belittled like that. But I wonder, so you mentioned also Rule 42, I think, of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anything you can imagine, there's a pornographic film or comic or something
Mm-hmm.
portraying that. And I wonder what philosophy has to say about that, particularly because I saw a paper that you cited by Thomas Nagel, who I would have thought of as a
Hmm.
very respected by the books philosopher, and I was surprised that he was writing a paper on sexual perversion.
Yeah. So I think it is, I think, a real mystery still to me why I mean, I mentioned earlier, sexual fantasy, people have the weirdest sexual fantasies. I mean, and so I was, why do people get off on being humiliated in these ways?
One of
So
the
it's,
first things
go
I
ahead.
saw on the internet, like, well, not one of the first things I saw was on the internet, but one of the first pornographic videos I ever saw as like a 14-year-old was a woman just sitting there, and then she pulls up her skirt, spreads her legs, and an octopus comes out of her vagina.
I
And
see.
yeah, it I mean, those things have an effect on you. Obviously, that's
Yeah.
stuck with me, but I don't think in 100 years of thinking about what I might find in pornography that would have come to
Hmm.
mind, and yet there it
That's
was.
very, very strange. I hadn't heard of that one. Um, yeah, I'm not sure I want to think much more about that. Um, Yeah, I mean, so there is this whole thing, for example, called small penis humiliation, where women produce these sorts of videos where they just kind of, you know, laugh in a way at how small this guy's penis is and so forth. And it's, they're usually just the women themselves, and the men who watch these may or may not have small penises, but they kind of get off on being talked to in these ways. And I think, here, I mean, I think, probably one just needs to go deep into the kind of psychological literature on things like this. And I do think there has been some real insight in the kind of psychoanalytic literature. I've found some interesting things there that throws some light on this, but I'm not sure, honestly, how much philosophy has to contribute to our
Mhm.
understanding the nature of fantasies like this, other than, I think, to kind of counsel us again that the relationship between, you know, I think it's important to appreciate that the kinds of emotions that are involved here can be erotically powerful, but only when it takes place in a certain kind of safe space, right? Um, so, you know, there's there's a difference between the kind of humiliation that's occurring in cases like this and what you might think of as genuine humiliation. So I'm gonna guess that if a man who got off on this kind of thing were to be with a woman in real life who genuinely humiliated him over, say, the size of his penis or something, it would be no more pleasant for him than it would be for anybody else to be humiliated in various ways. It's only because it's taking place inside a kind of broader structure where there is at least, something that's signaling that this is not all that it appears to be. That it's able to be experienced as erotic. So I think in some ways this is again the kind of goes back to the idea that, you know, things can turn you on for all kinds of reasons and you're not really in control of that. And you need to find and there are ways in which one can find a kind of safe space to explore the erotic potential of these sorts of things without the dangers that might otherwise accompany them. BDSM
This is kind.
obviously is the kind of, I mean, that's in effect what we're talking about.
This is kind of straying from the realm of philosophy to abject speculation. But I was surprised when you said that more typically men with more typical penis sizes are also getting off on these videos. But I can just imagine that watching that video and seeing this other guy get belittled kind of
Hmm.
makes somebody without that problem feel much better about themselves, which might be arousing. But
Oh.
I can't imagine why it turns on somebody who perceives themselves to be suffering from this particular problem.
Yeah, and I think, there's also the possibility of kind of projecting yourself. So I think in many cases, these are sort of, there's no guy there at all. It's just the woman kind of talking to the camera. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
I've certainly read of men who say, look, I am, myself perfectly average size or something, but I like to imagine that I'm not, and, be the recipient of this kind of thing. So, imagination, I mean, I think oftentimes, or I don't remember where I first heard this, but it's all another thing that sex therapists will kind of commonly say, which is that the mind is the most powerful sexual organ. And so, in order to understand these kinds of, why people are getting off on this, I think you really have to really, think about sort of what the thought process is that's attached to it. And that's some, I mean, actually, this does get back to the Nagel paper. I mean, that paper is, we often start with that in the philosophy of sex class. And he has, one of the things I like about it is that he pays a lot of attention to what people nowadays call the intentional, with it, as in the sense of intentionality aspects of sexuality, that it's not just a matter of kind of bodily stimulation and all that kind of thing, but it's got a lot to do also with, what you're thinking when you're having sex. And the kind of, Nagel puts a lot of emphasis on kind of communication and stuff in his account of sexuality. But it's I think that's very important to kind of keep in mind, that sex for humans is really a profoundly complex psychological phenomenon, and just not just a matter of kind of bodily, organ stimulation or something like that. Even, there's one of my favorite papers on this is by a guy named Serial Morgan, which we read, in which he talks about cases, where, I don't know. I mean, we all know that sex with someone you really care about can be much more powerful than sex with someone you don't have any kind of relationship with. And a lot of that is just, part of it's that you're freer and so forth. But I think part of it is just that, that this person you're doing this with is someone that you have certain feelings for, and that all, profoundly affects the nature of the sexual experience.
Mm-hmm. So, as I try to link together some of the things that we've talked about, uh, so we've talked about the dynamics of consent, the embrace of, or I don't know if embrace is the right word, but uh, fetishes, the embrace of fetishes,
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say it, the lack of preparation in anal sex, and then some things we haven't talked about, like fake orgasms.
Mm-hmm.
That brings me to another topic that I saw, which is quote unquote the problem of authenticity
Mm-hmm.
in porn. Can you tell me a bit about the problem of
Yeah,
authenticity?
so this is, I find this one quite fascinating, actually, because one of the things, so if you go back to the kind of early days of feminist pornography in the 80s, um, one of the things that that the women who were making this kind of pornography, so Candida Royale was the most important of these women. One of the things that they were really focused on was the kind of fake moaning that's very kind of famously typical of pornography, right? The sort of
Mm-hmm.
exaggerated sexual response that women are portrayed as having in pornography. And so they wanted to replace this with something that was more authentic, right? More true to women's sexual experience. So, not apparently having an orgasm 3 seconds after the guy, inserts his penis, but, clitoral stimulation and the other kinds of things that actually tend to produce arousal and orgasm in women. And so it became a kind of watchword in a way with feminist pornography, that that it was meant to be more authentic than mainstream pornography was, especially in connection with women's sexual response. And it so if we're thinking about kind of uh, what used to be called all sex pornography, right, where we're just in effect filming sex scenes, you can see why that might be thought to be really important. But some of the people, so Vex Ashley in particular wrote a paper about this, and she
Her
makes
first name's Vex.
Vex, Vex, yeah. I
That's a
assume
cool
it's a
name.
stage name, but though I
Yeah.
don't know for sure. I don't know her personally, but she makes these very artsy sorts of films, and she has at least raised the question whether it's really important in a film if a woman has a genuine orgasm as opposed to being able to convincingly portray herself as having had one. And from a filmmaking point of view, you might think, no, really. I mean,
Right.
if from the point of view of the viewer, it's might as well be that she really had one. I mean, we don't
Right.
you don't normally think that was this person really sad when they were crying in the movie.
Mhm.
That's not
But
a
of course,
measure.
pornography might be. Maybe we should think about pornographic films very differently from Hollywood films,
Yeah, and I
and
think
have
in
different
some
expectations.
ways this gets back to something we talked about last time about this idea that a lot if you think of pornography as a kind of just window onto a real world happening, so that you'd kind of just as well be there and seeing the real thing as seeing a film of it, then you can kind of see why the authenticity issue might be quite important
Mm-hmm.
to you. But if you're really thinking of yourself as kind of, as Vex does, making a film, that's telling a story, even it might be a short one or something, then maybe you think, no, I mean, the sex is part of the story, and I want to move the story forward. And even if the point of the story is to arouse the viewer more than it is, to do anything else, you might think, again, as long as everything is portrayed in a sufficiently convincing way, then that's going to be good enough. And so, one way to think of this, you might think that the problem that people like Royale were identifying wasn't so much that it wasn't authentic, it's that it was obviously inauthentic, and that's where the problem really lay. And not that sort of everything needs to be authentic and nobody ever needs to do any acting, but rather that they need to be convincing, and not just sort
Mm.
of, obviously. I mean, the problem was that it was obviously faked, not that it wasn't real.
So last time we talked, which was last week, you mentioned that sound in pornography was a big topic. And as when you mentioned that, I was thinking, music. I wonder what music is going on in pornography. But now that we've just talked about fake orgasms a bit, I realized that when you were talking about sound in pornography, you might have also been referring to bodily sounds or
Yeah, that's right.
moaning, that sort of thing. And now that I think about the mirror game, I do not recall there being this nonstop chorus of moans that you might find in a non-feminist
Yeah,
pornographic
that's right.
movie.
That's right.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that I think is so. I mean, this kind of links back to something else we were talking about. I can't remember, but where I've seen it's not in any of the papers that were on the syllabus, but I've read various other things where women will talk about the kinds of expectations that men have about how women's bodies respond sexually, and in particular the kinds of noises they make, right? So that women kind of feel like they're not doing it right somehow if they're not making, if they're not moaning like continuously. And so they kind of, sometimes women will say, they kind of force themselves to do that. They learn the way that their partners are expecting them to respond sexually. And so again, I mean, think this is another way in which, pornography can kind of misshape men's expectations of the way women's bodies respond sexually, to the great detriment of women.
I might be totally confabulating this, but or I don't know if that's the right word, fabricating this. But I seem to recall that there was a Seinfeld episode where maybe it's George, maybe it's Jerry, but and again, this might just be my imagination, but somebody becomes under the impression that they should be talking dirty when they're having sex,
Mm-hmm.
and it's probably George, and maybe they say that maybe he says his penis is like a corn cob or something, and it just doesn't work out well. But that's I don't know if they get the idea from pornography,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very easy to see how what's happening in these movies and the sound, like talking in
Mm-hmm.
particular, uh, get like choke on it, bitch. The title
Yeah.
of that paper. Most I, I hesitate to call them good people. Probably aren't saying choke on it, bitch, naturally, but if they see that in a movie, it might more quickly come to their lips if that's what they
Mm-hmm.
think that they're supposed to say or what their partner finds
Yeah.
erotic.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's and that's a lot of what Madison's talking about in that paper, right? The way in which these sort of there's a really wonderful piece actually by a woman named Violet Blue. She started out as she worked for a long time for the sex shop Good Vibrations in San Francisco, which was one of the first women-owned sex shops in the country. And she now actually does a lot of writing about kind of internet security and stuff like that. But for many, many years, she did porn reviewing. She was both a kind of curator for Good Vibrations, but she also did some independent reviewing of pornography. And she wrote this thing in like 2005 when the kind of rough sex kind of thing in pornography was really getting going. And what she points out in that is that in a kind of BDSM context where everything's been kind of negotiated and people have their limits established and safe words and all that other kind of thing, a lot of these kinds of activities can be very enjoyable for people. And that kind of degrading language, we were just talking about small penis humiliation and so forth, can be hot to people. But you don't really get that context in mainstream pornography. It ends up looking like this is just kind of how things are, right? This is how people talk when they have sex. This is how people act when they have sex. They choke their partners and they slap them and they spank them and they do all these other things. And all of that can be fine, right? I mean, as long as it's been discussed and, and so forth. But you just don't get that context. And so, as I said last time, I mean, from the women who in my classes who talked to me, I mean, yeah, it does seem that a fair number of men who, are otherwise intelligent, thoughtful people are coming away with the impression that this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to choke your partner and pull their hair and call them a bitch and so forth, and without any discussion ahead of time. And that's there's something really wrong with that. I mean, I just find that so deeply disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
I it just really upsets me that's what women are dealing with.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking for it looks like 70 minutes now. And do you want to keep talking a little more, or I know
Yeah,
you
it's
said
fine.
you were
No,
building something in the
no,
kitchen.
yeah.
Okay.
The thing I have on my schedule is 3 o'clock Germany versus France in the women's European Soccer Championships. So
Okay.
that I'm not going to
Okay.
miss.
Okay.
But I can
Well,
talk for a while. So
I won't keep you that long. So, have you read the book The Denial of Death? I think it's by Ernst Becker.
mm-mm.
Well, I think it's a pretty famous book I don't know if one would classify it as a psychoanalytic book, but one of the things that stuck with me in the text was his evaluation of the image of like serpents that are sort of eating their tail,
Mm-hmm.
or man's preoccupation with sucking one's own penis.
Mm-hmm.
And I I think what he contended, which at the time I found absolutely ridiculous because I was not at all convinced of or interested in psychoanalytic theory, but he thought that we man had this image of sucking his own penis because man wanted to sort of live forever and recreate himself. That was also, I think, part of his explanation of homosexuality, is
Mm-hmm.
that man loved himself and wanted to be with himself and reproduce himself, even though two men. Well, I don't know what I can say politically. What's
Yeah, right.
politically
Yeah.
correct? I don't know, but I'm going to say that two men can't
Two male-bodied people
have
anyway, yeah.
two male-bodied people.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't have a baby. So I am curious about gay porn or queer porn, or however we want to call it, whatever we want to call it, compared to straight porn. Is there is there much of a distinction between the two as far as academics are concerned, or are they treated the same? Do the same issues apply? I kind of That's a leading
Yeah.
question because
No, yeah.
I've seen that that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, some of the issues are similar. I think the I mean, it's been interesting actually in some in the classes that I've taught on this, to hear perspective of gay male students on stuff like this. And one of the things, I'm not, it's not my subculture as it were, so I'm kind of going off a lot of what they're telling me. And one of the things that many of them have talked about is the the sort of strength of this top bottom dichotomy among gay men.
Huh.
So you're either a fucker or you're a fucky, basically, is the distinction. And
And people align with one. It's
yeah,
not you're
that you're
not
kind of
both.
expected to align. I mean, so as in the
Huh.
BDSM world, there can be people who are switches. It's what's the BDSM term, right? That you kind of
Yeah,
be,
I've
you can be
heard that
top or you
word.
can be a bottom. And so I think there are, people in the gay male world who are switches in that. I don't know if that's the term they use. Um, but my sense from them is that you're kind of expected to be one of those two things. And the more disturbing thing to them, and also to me, is that these two roles are not seen as equal. One of them is seen as more desirable, in effect, than the other, or better than the other. And you can guess for yourself which one is seen as the more desirable or better. And in effect, the more masculine of the two roles. This is gender dynamic. This is something that McKinnon actually, she gets some of it wrong, but she's right about a lot of things. And one of the things that she seems to be right about is that there are lots of ways in which kind of gender dynamics continue to play out inside homosexual relationships,
Mm-hmm.
even though we're talking about two people of the same gender. And the form that seems to take in a lot of gay male sexuality is this top bottom dynamic. And in
Yeah, I heard.
porn, yeah, go ahead.
I heard a gay comedian that I like. His name is Tim Dillon. But I heard him mention recently on his podcast that within the gay community, it is highly desirable to be. I think the term he used was straight passing.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't, if you don't look like you're gay or don't come off as gay to people's gaydars, that's like a
Yeah,
very attractive thing. That probably means on some level that you appear traditionally masculine.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
Um,
because
yeah, but sorry for cutting you off.
no, because the contrast, right, is the sort of limp-wristed queer guy, right? I mean, so
Mhm.
that's the so. I mean, unfortunately, instead of like saying, look, it's fine to be that way, right? People, the gay community itself seems to have embodied this idea. No, we should look like straight people. That's the better thing to do. And so the thing I was going to mention was that you see this play out in gay porn, that there are lots of, so there are some gay male porn stars are tops and other ones are bottoms. And in a way, never the twain shall meet, right? That and the people who are the most popular gay male porn stars are the tops, right? They're the ones that people want to see. And the so I mean, I think that's kind of fascinating aspect of gay male pornography. But you also get some of this same kind of violent sort of stuff going on, degrading language and slapping and all the stuff we were talking about before with straight pornography. You see in gay pornography as well, with many of the same effects. There's I think I can't remember. There's a paper that I have as an optional reading called "Gag the Fag," which is about a website by that title. I don't know if it still exists or not, but it involves kind of lots of very degrading stuff to bottoms, basically. I mean, sort of face fucking them until they puke is the kind of thing of the kind of trope of the website. But so you in some ways, gay male pornography, a lot of it is not very different from straight pornography. Though there is, I should say, there also is a kind of, I mean, I tend to distinguish a bit between queer pornography, even queer gay male pornography, and kind of mainstream gay male pornography. There are some people out there who are trying to make what you might, I mean, this is not the right terminology, but it gets you in the right ballpark, kind of feminist gay male
Yeah,
pornography.
that's what I thought you were
Um,
going to say.
and so, and some of that stuff is really, there's a guy named
Intersectional
Noel
feminist.
Alejandro who makes beautiful, just beautiful, beautiful films. And he's gay, and his characters are usually gay, and so there is that sort of stuff out there too. Um, in the so gay male pornography kind of goes way back, that almost to the beginning of hardcore pornography as we know it. Gay men were starting to make these sorts of films, and lesbian pornography I think is quite different. Its roots, so with lesbian pornography you get kind of um, lesbian pornography that's made by men for men.
Hmm.
That it's not, a lot of it's not even kind of real sex. It's just sort of performed. But lesbian pornography made by women for women is kind of queer from the start, and is not um, partaking of the same kinds of tropes that mainstream pornography does, in the way that gay male pornography did from the beginning.
So we talked a bit about how philosophy might lend, or philosophers might lend insight into discussions of pornography. So one of the papers, again, that you've cited is called "When Selves Have Sex:
Mm-hmm.
What the Phenomenology of Transsexuality Can Teach About Sexual
Yeah,
Orientation."
Talia May Becher.
And so I don't know too much about phenomenology. I sat in on a few uh, lectures about it. But so before you tell me what the phenomenology of transsexuality can teach about sexual orientation, can you say a bit about just what phenomenology is to begin
Gosh,
with?
I wish I could.
Well,
I'm in
here's what
kind of the same
comes to
boat
mind
that
for
you
me from,
are.
because we read the beginning of Husserl,
Mm-hmm.
and what I sort of recall it being was sort of throw out everything you think you know about the world, everything, and then you take sort of what you see, what you feel, what you experience. That's the only data you have to work with, and
Mm-hmm.
you sort of construct a philosophy of the world or
Yeah.
experience based on that.
Yeah.
And
So one of the things that's been interesting about doing this work is that, I given what I've mostly done. Unsurprisingly, I kind of grew up in the analytic philosophy world,
Yeah,
and
so different.
that's just that I'm kind of hardcore analytic philosopher for most of my life, and was very dismissive about a lot of continental philosophy without knowing anything about it. Just fessing up that to my earlier attitudes, but and I still find a great deal of it to be kind of pointlessly obscure and so forth. But on the other hand, I've learned that there are tremendous insights in a lot of this work. I think Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality is just pure genius as far as I'm concerned, though it has its moments of pointless obscurity too. Um, and so I've started to learn a bit more about this. So I tend to think of phenomenology as kind of the way you describe it, that it sort of pays tremendous attention to the kind of fine structure of experience and tries to develop insight out of that. So in that paper, there's a kind of well, one way to think of what Betcher's arguing there is that, and I think she does this in another paper too, is that so there was a movement some years ago to stop talking about sexual orientation in as sort of homosexuality or heterosexuality, but rather to focus it on the gender of your sexual object choice, as people put it,
Yeah,
so that you're
my sister and
gynocentric
I.
or androcentric.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my sister identifies as queer, and she's getting married this summer to a somebody who I think identifies as a woman and is woman bodied, and I referred to I'm officiating the wedding. I'm
Mhm.
now a reverend, and I
Ah,
referred to it as a lesbian wedding, and I was corrected that it was not a lesbian wedding at all. And then my sister and I went through all of the different like queer, lesbian, the
mhm,
various terms, and even though my sister is getting married to a woman, I don't think that she would have any problem with me saying this publicly. She finds some men or other people attractive
mhm,
as well, and because she has, I think of this like with as like sets or ordered pairs with relations,
mhm,
but because the second in the tuple could be a man or a woman, she's not lesbian. She's
mhm,
queer, even if she identifies as a woman herself. So,
mhm.
so yeah, sorry if I just
No,
went
yeah,
off on too big of a
yeah.
tangent.
So a lot of people would the older, and I think this is actually still true, that this kind of established way of thinking about this among theorists of sexuality would say they would kind of focus on the fact that she's attracted to both men and women, or whatever, and kind of leave her gender out of the equation, right? So that it doesn't matter whether she's a man or a woman or identifies as non-binary or whatever. The only thing, sexual orientation, is about who she's attracted to. And what Betcher argues in that paper is that we shouldn't leave out the gender of the person in question, that there can be something about the experience of being a woman having sex with a woman can be quite different from the experience of being a man having sex with a woman, even though, right, the gender of the person that you're attracted to is constant in those cases. So, and I think Betcher herself is a trans woman, and so to some extent speaks from experience, right? In that she continues to have sex with women after she's transitioned, and she tries to describe like what the difference is. How is it different to have sex as a woman, in effect, than to have sex as a man? And one of the things she focuses on in that paper is I can't remember how she describes this, but basically the kind of different parts of your own body that are kind of eroticized. So, right, as a woman, your chest is much more erotically loaded than your chest is as a man, and letting someone see your chest is a sexual act for a woman in a way that it's not for a man. And So she's very interested in the kind of, again, this kind of goes back to the Nagel thing before, the kind of interplay that happens between two people as they're, different, as I share parts of my body with someone, and that can be a part of my sexual experience that is a function of my gender, and not just the gender of the person that I'm having sex with. So
Hmm.
that's the kind of main point of the paper. But yeah, it's really fascinating. She's very interesting writer on these topics.
Yeah, that's neat. I like that. So, huh. There is one other topic that I'd really like to talk about today.
Okay.
So, hmm. Are you familiar with the name Jordan Peterson?
Hmm. Yep.
So I think he once taught at Harvard too, uh, and was most recently at the University of Toronto. But he is, for good reason, very much maligned by a lot of people. But I also think he has done a lot of very interesting work. He made the Bible interesting to me in
Hmm.
some lectures I heard. But most recently, he did something pretty tasteless, which was he he posted on Twitter an image of like the most recent Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, which has a quote unquote plus size model on the
Hmm.
cover, and he tweeted something to the effect. Well, here I can just Google it to make sure that I get it right. Jordan Peterson, Sports Illustrated. Sorry, not beautiful, and no amount of authoritarian tolerance is going to change that. So it seems like not well. I don't know if this is much discussed in pornography, but at least in philosophy of sex, it seems like there's been a lot of work in on fatness
Hmm.
or people's tastes in different
Hmm.
types of body.
Yeah.
At one paper, it looked like, getting back to Aristotle, talk about taste and habituation.
Yeah. Anne Eaton's
So,
paper. Yeah.
have you worked on this at all? Or
So we do. I have not worked on it myself, but I do find it quite interesting, and I think this. So the paper you're referring to is a paper by Anne Eaton, who teaches at University of Illinois Chicago, called "Taste and Bodies and Fat Oppression," and
yeah,
that paper. So she argues in that paper that the aesthetic undesirability of fat bodies is an important component of the oppression of fat people. And she goes, I mean, one of the contributions it made for me was just to make me fully aware of just how many things there are that oppress fat people. And, um, and
can you
I
give
think
me some examples?
so. I mean, fat people have a very hard time accessing healthcare. For example, that the medical establishment is often not well equipped to care for them, and this is just a matter of, as far as I can tell, laziness. That gowns not being big enough for them in doctors' offices, tables and chairs not being big enough for them. I mean, there are all kinds of sort of very simple things like that fat people have, make it difficult for fat people to access healthcare. I mean, on the other kind of end of the scale are issues about travel, like on airplanes and buses and things like that, seats not being suitable size for them, being forced to pay extra to travel on airplanes because they might occupy more than one normal size seat, or typical size seat. There are all kinds of things like this, that Anne just sort of details in that paper. And then I should say she herself is a very athletic, thin sort of person. So she's not. Um, This is not something she speaks to from experience, at least personal experience. Um, but as I say, she sort of goes on to argue that the sort of so most of her own work is in aesthetics, and she actually has she has two PhDs, one in art history and one in philosophy both from Chicago. Um, and she goes on to argue, as I said, that the sort of fact that fat people are seen as ugly in the way that quote illustrates is not just a kind of aspect in a way of this oppressive structure, but is part of what reinforces it and maintains it. It that fat people that so she mentions other data, right? For example, that the more attractive you're seen to be, the higher your pay is likely to be. Um, Even if your job has absolutely nothing to do with being attractive, right? Like being a model or a Hollywood actress or something, right? It just, this is what people sometimes call lookism nowadays, that people who are more attractive just have all kinds of advantages, social advantages over people who aren't seen as attractive. And fat people as a class are generally seen as unattractive and therefore suffer both from those particular, from that general structure, but also from more specific things. And so, I do think that she's, the other thing that the big, I remember talking to Anne about this paper once, and she told me that when she was giving it, presenting it at colloquia and stuff before it was published, people would often ask her in the discussion something like, are you saying that I should find fat people attractive? Are you saying that like it's bad of me not to find fat people attractive? I should do something to like change who I find attractive? And she was kind of pulled two ways about this. I mean, on the one hand, she was thinking, well, you can't really control who you find attractive. I mean, that was decided when you were, 2 years older or something. So it's not like she thinks everybody needs to go on a kind of personal transformation project to change, who they find attractive. But then on the other hand, she wanted to say, well, but yes, on the other hand, I mean, shouldn't we be aware of the harm? I mean, if she's right that this kind of collective distaste for fat bodies is doing, but shouldn't we also be conscious of the fact that this is, these are preferences that have been socially shaped by forces that have their own interests in a way. So one can think, I pair this paper with when we read it with a couple of papers on sort of sexual fetishes for Asian people, so-called yellow fever, and the those papers talk a lot about ways in which kind of Western attitudes about Asian people and appearance and exoticness and stuff kind of you know, negatively affect the experience of Asian women in particular, but I think also Asian men. So, I mean, there are, the term in the gay world is rice queens. I mean, white men who are attracted to Asian women or Asian men. And so all of these papers kind of raise these questions about, what should we do with the fact that we do kind of find ourselves saddled with these erotic preferences that are shaped by social forces that we may not agree with. Sort of when you
Mhm.
realize. So I mentioned several times about sort of hearing from my students about stuff like this, but I remember I've had several students kind of come to me and say, I thought I liked, so these are women again. I thought I liked it when guys kind of slapped me and called me a bitch and stuff. But now that I think about it and kind of realize where that's coming from and stuff, I don't know if I like it anymore. You know, or I do like it, but I don't want to like it. Is what one woman said, and that's again, that's the sort of it's the opposite way with the fat woman, right? It's sort of, yeah, I don't find her attractive, but I kind of wish I did, or something. And it's that's a kind of tough position to be in. I mean, what do you do with things like that? I'm not sure I've not seen my way through this yet.
Yeah, as somebody who likes to sit down and watch the mirror game with a quart of ice cream, I found myself the other day wishing that fatness could become attractive so that I could give up exercising and devote more of my
Yeah,
energy to ice cream.
yeah.
But
I'm a big ice cream person too, so.
yeah, I wonder if, I mean, one of the reasons that this issue uh, inspires so much vitriol, the way that Jordan Peterson's, or as Jordan Peterson's tweet reflects, is that our sexual preferences seem so strongly ingrained in us that
Mhm.
they seem biological. It's almost like telling somebody that no, that's not red, it's green. Just look at it, it's green.
Yeah.
Uh, so it and it really does feel that way. It doesn't. When
Mhm.
I look at somebody I find attractive, I don't have the feeling that it's an option to
Mhm.
choose. And
Yeah.
so I wonder, because I'm not familiar with the literature or the physiology of it, but being told that it's something that is socially shaped just rings contrary to my experience of the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, my sense is that these things are, it's also part, I mean, I think Foucault is big on this actually, that we both experience these things as kind of not something we choose, but also as kind of very much part of who we are as people, right? Like, so think about sexual orientation, right? I mean, people think of this as part of their identity, right? I mean, that you're
Mm-hmm.
attracted to men instead of women or women instead of men. That's, we sort of think of that as very much part of who we are as human beings. And so in one paper, I think this is in the yellow fever paper, one of the objections that she considers when she's talking about this is that, well, what about gender, right? I mean, so she's worried about like men who are attracted to Asian women, and oftentimes this attraction is kind of rooted in stereotypes about Asian women that are really like of being submissive and all these kinds of things. And so she's arguing in that paper that, this is a not, to minus third approximation or something, that, people shouldn't be attracted to Asian women because they're Asian, that there's something wrong about that. There's something, roughly speaking, racist about that. And one of the objections she considers is that, well, what about gender, right? Lots of people, some people are attracted to men instead of women and women instead of men. Should you think that it's sort of somehow sexist of us to be attracted to someone, for gender to play that much of a role in our attraction to somebody? And she suggests in that paper, and other people have suggested as well, that actually the answer should be yes. Actually, gender should not. As long as gender is an important component of who we find attractive, that makes gender a factor in the social world that that it shouldn't be. Um, and I don't, again, I don't know what I want to say about this. Um, but that's in a way the hardest case, right? That because that is the element of kind of sexual attraction and sexual, what we call sexual orientation, that is in a way most deeply ingrained, like the gender of the people that you're attracted to. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know whether there's a line you can draw here between the fat case and the gender case, or whether they really are just two versions of the same thing.
Well, returning to the fat case for a moment, because I don't think that there is an analog here. Are you familiar with the? Well, I imagine it's crossed your mind or what you've read at some point with the subgenre of pornography called. Well, I don't know if it has a title, but it involves a quote unquote feeder.
Mm-mm. At least not yet.
Yeah. So a feeder is typically a smaller man who has a very obese uh, woman partner who, in the pornography, involves him feeding her vast quantities of food.
I see.
So, but you haven't
No,
encountered
I
that.
have. This is one
Uh,
that's new to me. Yeah.
yeah, that one's really fascinating to me. As I think about it right now, I sort of think of him as like a subservient
Mm-hmm.
aunt to like his queen,
Mm-hmm.
like the queen in the colony, and
Uh-huh.
he's bringing her food. But okay,
Right.
I was going to ask if you had encountered that in the literature or anything, and if anybody had thoughts on that, because for me. Disclosure, this is not a sexual fetish, but I am
Mm-hmm.
like so obsessed with food that like if I'm on a diet or something, I will like sniff other people's food if they will
Uh-huh.
allow me to at times, or
Mm-hmm.
I'll watch them eat. Um, I was on a very intense diet a couple of months ago, and I found myself watching videos of people binge eating on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And there was again like no sexual component to this, but
Right.
there's like sort of a kinship or a similarity there to people who
Mm-hmm.
watch this pornography. So I was hoping for some
Mm.
insight into what's going on,
No, that
but
one's new to
I
me.
guess I'll have to look elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. There's actually not. Excuse me. Hold on a sec. Sorry. Just
I hope I haven't made you sick.
No, I have really bad allergies, so it's
Hmm.
I just, and especially in this time of year, it just my I'm constantly congested and stuff. So and I get post nasal drip, so that's why I seem a bit hoarse. I mean, the one so race has been written a lot about in the kind of literature on pornography because interracial porn, we talked about this a bit last time, is can be so problematic. But there's not as much yet, anyway, that I've come across on disability. I've seen a couple of papers on that. Amputee
Oh,
porn.
disabled
Yeah,
porn or
yeah.
fetish.
It's
Okay,
like, I mean,
that's
there's
one
a,
I
a lot.
hadn't encountered, but imagine
Yeah,
existed.
yeah. There's a amputee fetish, disabled, kind of porn goes way back. Um, and again, I've seen a few things, very rare. Again, really rare porn, kind of more, what you might think of as more progressive porn featuring disabled people. That is really, really, really unusual. I've seen a little bit of that occasionally. I've seen more sort of fat positive porn. That there are several people who have made that kind of porn. I think most famously a woman named Courtney Trouble, who is herself a fat woman who makes some really amazing stuff. But not many people have written about that. The paper by Eaton actually is one of the only things I know on kind of erotics and fat bodies. It's not much studied.
Okay. Well, thanks again for another wonderful conversation. This has been
Sure, it's been
so
great.
productive and enlightening for me. So, and I really think that this is an underexplored and under talked about topic. So, I imagine the people who listen to this will also find it pretty eye opening and illuminating about something sex that's, and for some people, pornography, where that's a big part of their life. So, thanks
Yeah,
again for
sure.
joining
Yeah,
me for this.
I do think it's kind of a growth industry. I think there are more people. I think over the next 10 years or so, we're going to start to see a lot of work on this kind of thing. I know several people. Carrie Ishikawa Jenkins has been working on more philosophy of love and stuff, but she and her partner Jonathan have been writing some stuff in this area, and I think they've got some students at UBC who are doing this kind of thing. I've had some students who are interested in this, and I think we're going to see a lot more on this in the next decade or so.
Okay. Well, here's the part where I sort of like do a fake goodbye and say until next
Right?
time, but
Yeah.
I'm really just going to stop recording. So thanks again.
Okay. Take care.
I have recorded this about 10 times because I'm just so bad at asking for help, but If you could like, subscribe, comment on whatever medium you're consuming this nascent fledgling podcast on, that would be so helpful, because the best thing for helping me grow this podcast at this point is making it at least appear that I have an audience. So thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting me.